One criticism of urbanism and the movement for walkable cities is that it's just a fad among young people who have no responsibilities and want to be close to trendy bars, restaurants, and concerts. They'll grow out of it and move to the suburbs when they want to settle down and start families. We actually have our first child on the way, so in this video we want to talk about what this gets wrong, whether it gets anything right, and what urbanism means for families.
This criticism starts with a pretty narrow view of the appeal of cities. Entertainment is nice, and people should be able to get home from bars without driving. But more fundamentally, cities are about jobs and opportunity. What cities people choose to live in, and where they choose to live within the city, is about proximity and access to work as much as anything else. Central locations tend to provide more job opportunities and shorter commutes. Focusing on bars and trendy restaurants is a way to trivialize what draws people to cities all around the world.
However, urbanism isn't actually about not living in the suburbs. It's about walkability, density, housing variety, mixed-use neighborhoods, and transit access. These are more typical of central cities, partly because of when they were built, but they can exist in suburbs too. Suburbs might always have lower densities than downtowns, but they can still be dense enough to be walkable or at least bike-friendly. They can have good transit. Lots of older suburbs in North America were built around streetcars or commuter rail. That's not the norm anymore, but Urbanist YouTube talks a lot about building better suburbs. The message hasn't been that suburbs are inherently bad.
We've gravitated towards central neighborhoods in every city we've lived in. Why? Partly for shorter commutes to jobs and other destinations downtown. Partly because they tend to be denser and it's really convenient being able to walk out your door and have groceries just down the block. Partly because we value staying active and appreciate environments that encourage walking and cycling for transportation. It allows us to bake physical activity into our lives by default instead of going for a walk to get your steps, being a chore to fit in at the end of the day. We also like the denser network of transit offerings, which allows us to live easily without a car. That saves us money and headaches. We both grew up in small towns and rural areas, so we're plenty capable of driving. We just find driving in cities really unpleasant. Another advantage of denser neighborhoods is high-quality public spaces like parks and pedestrian streets.
It's not like you can't find any of the things we like in the suburbs. We know people who try to live more urbanist lifestyles there by choosing to live close to a transit station, recreational pathway, or older suburban town center. But you have to be more careful about where you live, and you're more likely to make compromises. Part of this is inherent to the location, but part of this is how we choose to design suburbs. Visiting the Netherlands, we found suburbs to be more bike-friendly than central cities, because they had more space for separated pathways. And it was really noticeable just how many kids and teenagers you saw out on bikes in Dutch suburbs. In North America, suburbs are slower to build cycling infrastructure because of the more entrenched car culture.
How much do our priorities change now that we have a child on the way? Short commutes and having things convenient and close by is still nice. Activity still matters a lot for our physical and mental health, and if anything, it's more important to incorporate activity into our daily routine if we're going to be busier with kids. No, that's not an announcement of twins. And as our child grows up, we'd like to provide him with an environment where he can get around independently. If you haven't noticed, kids can't drive. We are a little worried about transit becoming less convenient in the early years with a stroller, because only half of the Montreal metro stations have an elevator. We'll see how it turns out. It's nice that children ride transit for free here, because quickly multiplying fares can be a big barrier for families. When kids are a bit older, transit is another way for them to have independence. It's pretty common for kids in our city to take the bus around.
One thing that does obviously change with kids is the need for space, which tends to be more affordable the further you go from downtown. It's important to push back against the idea that large single-family houses are the only suitable environment for families, because lots of people happily raise kids in apartments and townhouses. But space still matters, and it's one big advantage of the suburbs for families. However, exactly how much space you can afford in the central city can vary a lot. When we moved back to Montreal, we actually planned for this and got an apartment with an extra bedroom, which was only possible in the somewhat more sane housing market here. If we were in Toronto or Vancouver, we'd be in a smaller place and having to make tough choices about whether to move or have kids at all. Our current apartment is enough for the foreseeable future, but we might need more space at some point. And our ability to continue living here will depend in a very direct way on the housing affordability situation.
When we talk to American friends, we hear that one of the main reasons people move to the suburbs there is for good schools. Urban schools are seen as underfunded, mismanaged, or undisciplined. We're not sure how much is perception versus reality, but it's a bit of a culture shock. We just don't have as much variation in the quality or perceived quality of schools here. Canadians are actually less likely than Americans to search good schools or bad schools on Google. And where school variation exists, it doesn't exactly map onto suburban being good and urban being bad. In Ontario, there's a perception of Catholic schools being better, and parents also seek out French immersion for higher achieving classmates. But if we're talking about reasons that people move to the suburbs in Canada, it's much more typically for space and affordability.
Planning for children makes us more attuned to safety, starting with raising our standards on road safety. The kind of environments that we're okay walking and cycling in might not be good enough for a child. North American suburbs feel like a land of extremes on road safety. Low-traffic residential suburban streets can be pretty good for children, but the monster arterial roads that divide up neighborhoods and provide access to most destinations are among the least child-friendly environments we can think of. We were watching the TV show Old Enough, a Canadian version of the Japanese show about kids running errands, mostly set in suburban Ontario. And it was obvious that the production team had to put in a lot of effort to keep kids safe near these roads. Denser central cities have larger arterial roads of their own, but they're usually easier to avoid, and they don't break up neighborhoods quite as consistently.
A lot of people think about safety in terms of crime. That might be a bigger problem where they live, but Montreal just isn't a very dangerous city, so it's not high on our minds. One exception is that there's been a spike in incidents on the metro, and we're concerned about the direction it could go. We were in San Francisco a few years ago and saw many people acting erratically and aggressively and doing hard drugs on BART. We mentioned it in our San Francisco video and thought to ourselves at the time that we wouldn't be as comfortable riding transit there if we had kids with us. Multiple people have told us that the situation on BART is much better now, but it's stuck in our minds as something we hope doesn't happen where we live. It's not just about being physically threatened, but also other quality of life issues. We've encountered people smoking on transit in 1 or 2 cities we visited, and it was a shock. If smoking on transit was common in our city, we'd be less inclined to take transit, especially with a kid. Some urbanists are dismissive about these safety and comfort concerns because sometimes they're exaggerated by people who just hate cities and transit. But as people who love cities and transit, this has the potential to be a blind spot for building child-friendly cities. Parents have higher standards for safety and comfort on transit, just like they do for bike infrastructure. You wouldn't take a child into a smoking restaurant, if those still existed, so why would you take your child on a smoking train?
One wild card here is family. Lots of people want to live close to family when they have kids. And if you picked your current location for its above-average urbanism, moving closer to wherever your parents live will probably mean a downgrade. The big weakness of North American urbanism is that there's a lot of inconsistency and variation. If you have the freedom to choose where to live, then you can select into a pretty good experience. But if you're limited to living in a certain place, because of family or a job or housing affordability, then the situation might look quite a bit more bleak. In our case, our families live in different provinces, and Montreal is already a compromised location between them, and there is no perfect solution for us here.
We'll no doubt talk in more detail about family-friendly urbanism in the future, but we wanted to start with a bird's-eye view in this video. So far, planning for our child hasn't massively changed our priorities because most of the things we care about, like active transportation, are just as important for children, if not more. But it has increased our perceived needs for space and our standards for things like road safety, and highlighted some of the unfortunate trade-offs that families have to make. To answer the question, do you need to move to the suburbs to have kids? That depends on where you live. If the suburbs of your city are the only place your child can get a quality education, then maybe you do. But this isn't a universal truth. It's a quirk of the school system in the US, and we're not sure it even applies everywhere there. Similarly, the housing crisis pricing people out of central neighborhoods in Canada, Australia, and coastal US cities is a policy failure. A lot more families would like to live centrally but are unable to because we don't allow enough homes to be built for them. But we're going to stress again that urbanism, as we think about it, isn't limited to downtowns and central cities. Families who choose to locate in the suburbs for space or whatever other reason should also have safer streets, active transportation, and housing options. Car-centric design and dangerous streets are bad things in general, but they're most bad for children who can't drive and are most vulnerable.
Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.